Well, first off, thank you, Utah. That was awesome. I learned a lot. I was taking like notes. I was like writing everything down there. But anyways, thank you for having me. Ours is not as mature, but I think it could show you from a different stage how this could be deployed on a more temporary basis and in areas that are more rural and that may not have comms. So you can go to the next slide. There you go. So right now, we have three areas that have large areas that have portable VSLs. So the ones that are circled red were there since 2021 or 2022 winter seasons. And then green was last year's winter season. And then the green out towards Ohio is coming this winter. We do have a permanent corridor outside Philadelphia that uses VSLs, but for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to be focusing on all the temporary deployments. You can go to the next one. So this is what the devices look like if you're unfamiliar. We have them deployed out there a lot of times behind guide rail to protect them. And then we work with our local district engineering districts and maintenance crews to build pads for them. So they work off solar, they have battery backup. That has been some maintenance concerns to the devices. So some of these are around 3 years old. We're working on that. We've had to replace some batteries. And then another thing that we're working on right now is the modem optimizations. So these come standard with either contractor modem, but from a DOT perspective, you're going to have to consider your comms and bringing them into your actual ATMS and your control equipment. So we are in the process of bringing them into our corridors module, is what we call it in Pennsylvania. It's essentially an active traffic management module that has our WIS station, speed data, so we can automate these things. So we're getting to the point where this winter we're going to be piloting automation around weather, much like what Utah just talked about. So these are the devices we have out there. So we're swapping out around 90 modems currently, and moving forward, we'll be able to use the algorithms we build into the existing corridors module. So you can keep going. So how did we pick these locations? We ran a lot of data. I think we looked at tens of thousands of RWIS station readings to understand where would be the primary locations we consider as. Now, if you're not familiar with Pennsylvania geography, we have the Appalachian Mountains. So they essentially run from a little west of Pittsburgh to the Harrisburg area, which is, if you can't really see that, but it's the I-81 corridor through to Allentown. And if you're following that to New York City, up to Maine. So it's going to follow that swath of land. Now, they're not as big as the Wasatch Mountains out in Utah, but there's some significant grades. And we get a lot of crashes, and unfortunate those major pileups that we never want to make the news about. So we decided that this was going to be a solution for us. And you saw the corridors earlier, and it seems that we're going to be expanding this statewide in other policies for our core roadway network. But what's showing in front of you is of those tens of thousands of readings from the RWIS stations. The larger the circle on the left is the number of stations that saw what we would consider whiteout conditions. It was something that in our study we determined what a whiteout would be from a DOT perspective. And then on the right-hand side, we correlated that with crash data to understand where we had those bad crashes and when they lasted 3 hours or longer. So you can go to the next slide. So we took it a little further. Some of you might have seen me look at this before, but this was the start of our automation. We're trying to do what Utah is doing, get ahead of the storm. So it's a little different from a weatherman perspective. We're trying to prevent crashes here. So we're looking for that tipping point and that likelihood of a crash. So we have low visibility, high wind, freezing surfaces, freezing rain, and slippery surfaces. The freezing surfaces and the slippery surfaces is what we're trying to pilot this winter. We see a lot of times that initial changeover of the storm is when we get a lot of our crashes. A lot of people aren't expecting it. the variable conditions come in quick, and we're gonna shoot to have the VSLs and then the associated CMS boards to help protect those areas around where we have RWIS stations. So we have around 95% RWIS station coverage on our core roadway network. I've said that a couple of times now. That's around 4,000 miles of roadway in Pennsylvania. We manage around 40,000, so it's roughly 10%. So it's your interstates, your interstate localites, and your major arterials. So you can keep going. So in Les's introduction, and I think with what Utah talked about, part of making this successful is CMS support. We've now piloted for a couple of years. How can we automate this? And we started with queue protection. We last year did high winds and whiteout conditions in our Erie district, where we get the most snow, and in the I-80 district in our northern tier. So what that does is it pulls those readings based off the visibility less than 1 mile, the rain state medium to heavy snow, and rain intensity above 0.04 inches per hour. Now, so I alluded to this earlier, that doesn't constitute a whiteout to a meteorologist. But for us and for the drivers, and you're traveling at significant speeds, it makes it very difficult to drive. And that was our threshold and our tipping point where we wanted to, in those 15-mile radius, post these messages as people were approaching these conditions. So we do that for high winds too. We have some bridges that are exposed in central Pennsylvania where we essentially soft close the bridge if they reach speeds above 50 miles per hour. It doesn't happen often, but we do that for specific bridges and corridors around the state as well. This was automating these messages was a work in progress with your TMCs, I'll be honest with you. Working out the priorities, working out how they override incident messages, working out how they override with vehicle restriction messages is not an easy process, especially when you have a lot of decentralized management. So I would say put some effort in the beginning of that. You're going to try to figure that out. And you can go to the next slide. I talk about that a little bit. So how we had to figure it out for our ATMS system is we needed a business rules engine. There's just so many variables that are going to go out there, and they change by every geographic area. One 15-mile radius might be a valley, the other might be a peak of a mountain. So what we've done is we've brought in a business rules engine into our ATMS platform that has the ability to look at slow or stop traffic. So that uses the INRIX data, and then it looks at the mile differentials of where those speeds are. And then if those speeds cross a threshold, we can essentially lower the VSLs ahead of those speed drops, and then also post queue protection messaging. And we're going to use that same methodology for weather as well. Right now, you can see at the bottom, the weather station search is at 15 miles, and then we can customize it by corridor. And the one example you see there is District 1, that's our Erie city area, and on I-90, which gets the most lake effect snow in Pennsylvania. So you can go to the next slide. So where I am today, I'm actually at our statewide TMC operations meeting in north central Pennsylvania. So I'm in Clearfield right now, talking from their TMC. So they were our first portable VSL or temporary VSL corridor, and we deployed this in the 2022 winter season. There was an unfortunate major pileup that caused a fatality in 2020, and a legislator asked us to essentially come in and work on something. So we threw a lot at this. We instituted, it was one of the first times we instituted the virtual queue protection corridor. We put VSLs out there. We partnered with all of our state police to be out there enforcing vehicle restrictions, chain restrictions, et cetera, through the mountains. So after that first year and that initial buy-in, you can see the drop. Now, it's coming out of COVID, so there might be some relationship there. But in 2021, 2022, we saw a drop from 37 crashes to 12. with 1 full closure, and then roughly averaging around four full closures the previous 5 years, and then no fatalities. And then in 2022 to 2023, it went back up to 27 crashes, but no full closures, and then 0 fatalities. Now they since expanded this. What we call the Allegheny Mountains is still the Appalachian Mountains, where this occurred in the 2022-2023. You can see the drop at the bottom now, where from 23 crashes to 14, from 6 full closures to 1, and then 0 to 0. So now this isn't a big data set here, but I think on the micro level, you can see there is an impact, right? We're still doing analysis on the other corridors, but we don't have a lot of the safety data yet since they're so new. But I wanted to, at least since this is our oldest, most mature corridor, show you that information. So you can go to the next slide. How does it now? We do have a lot of data on this. So how does it actually impact people's behaviors on speed? Now this is using INRIC speed data, and what we did is we compared areas where we have VSL and areas that we don't have VSL with the same conditions and the same type of roadway. So you saw that hazardous winter conditions before, and how we determined whiteout, low visibility, slippery surfaces, etc. So with no VSL, and we just posted a speed restriction, or people slowed down 8, -8, -3, -1. They didn't slow down at all for freezing rain, and then -1 mile per hour for freezing surface without VSL. When the TMCs, and part of our policy here in Pennsylvania is the TMCs have the authority, based off of our WIS stations and our current policy, to drop speeds 55 miles per hour manually still, when they see these conditions and the conditions warrant. Once they did that, you can see the difference there. So we're seeing deltas of an increase of speed drops of 6, 5, 9, 4, and 7 in those conditions. So on average, 4 to 9 mile per hour speed differential when we are using the speed drops in the VSL corridors. So that's a positive. You can go to the next slide. So when we do actual 45 mile per hour speed restrictions, which is something that has to be approved by what we call our area command, it's where I work in Harrisburg, and we have to figure out those speed drops. I don't per se figure it out, but it's a collaborative effort with a lot of different agencies. We see that in the areas with the VSL, we see an increased reduction of 4 miles per hour on the I-80 corridor, and then I-81, we saw an increase of 3 mile per hour drop in travel speeds during the last 2 winters. We have data. We'll go to the next slide. So this is similar to what Utah went over, and this is kind of my segue into automation and where we're at here in Pennsylvania. We have all this data. We're trying to figure out the algorithm that we want to do. We know the thresholds, and this is an example where we had restrictions in vehicle restrictions, and then we saw we turned on VSL at after the tier 1. You see that below speed drop right when we started to see the surface states deteriorate, and you can see the actual driver speeds reduce to around 45 miles per hour. And then when we kept it going, the speed restrictions were reduced. So this was what we consider one of our better times, but it emphasizes the point that people listen to this when we're comparing the information that we have out there in real time. Go ahead. You can go to the next one. So automation, So automation, this is just the first time I'll talk about this a little bit, and Les alluded to a little. We're seeing that our operators, and I from my personal perspective, I think it's a hard job for our operators to become meteorologists and follow the weather stations and then get them out there, and it's a lot of responsibility for them to do that. that. So we're moving this way. And what I wanted to share with you all is the I-76 automated corridor that we have VSLs, our only permanent location. We've seen significant impacts in the safety data. So overall crashes in that corridor outside of Philadelphia have dropped 22% when we instituted the VSLs and the algorithm that decreases people around 1 mile ahead of these speed drops. Rear end crashes have decreased 32%. And the big thing here is when we give any type of information and make it understandable to the motorist that, hey, if you see that, slow down, there's something there. The injuries and the severity of injuries significantly decrease. So you see 20% decrease, but a 62% drop in serious injuries. That is just a big win from the DOT perspective. And I know we're not talking about travel times right now, but travel times were greatly impacted as a result of this in 2021. But as things go in the transportation world, behavior changes. I think people get used to a system and they just start neglecting speeds. So we've seen the travel times go back up, and we're going to be issuing a press release with this information here in the future. But this is my pitch for automation, and we're working towards that here in the future. So thank you for having me.